All right, welcome back to the Debunking Rock Science Show. Well, it has now been 5 years since the terrorist attacks on September 11th shocked the nation and devastated many lives. Although the tragedy event should not be forgotten or mitigated, a growing number of conspiracy theorists have proposed that more happened on that fateful Tuesday morning than is officially being recounted. But do these theories stand up to detailed scientific investigation? Well, these claims are investigated in the new book, Debunking 9/11 Myths, Why Conspiracy Theories Can't Stand Up to the Facts, released by Popular Mechanics and based on a popular article originally published in the magazine. We are pleased to have joining us Mr. James Meggs, editor-in-chief of Popular Mechanics and one of the editors behind this book. Mr. Meggs, thank you very much for joining us today on the Grok Science Show.
It's my pleasure.
I think for most of us who remember the events of that day, the official explanation actually makes a lot of sense. But I'm curious, in your experience, in general, where do the questions and ambiguities arise for these conspiracy theorists?
Well, you mentioned what the official explanation. I think one thing that you see a lot in the conspiracy movement is the attempt to try to make it sound as if what we know about September 11th is all just the product of the government. And in fact, what we know about that day comes from a huge array of sources, from eyewitnesses, journalists from all over the world, a number of studies that were commissioned by the government, but many that were put together by outside organizations, engineering groups. And it's a remarkable accumulation of evidence. And typically what we see in conspiracy theories is they ignore all that evidence and zero in on a few small details that they think are anomalous and that would, if true, completely discredit the mainstream view. So what we did was we just focused in strictly on the factual points that conspiracy theorists themselves most often cite in defense of their theories. We didn't get into the politics. I mean, we're Popular Mechanics. We're a magazine about facts. So we just focused on things like the claim that jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel, therefore it can't account for why the World Trade Center towers fell down. There must have been bombs in the building, or the idea that the hole in the Pentagon wasn't big enough to have been made by a commercial jet. It must have been a guided missile. And so we really tried to track those down and essentially fact-check them and see what the facts are. And what was so interesting was in every single case, the very facts and even the quotes that were being used to support these theories turned out to be just flat wrong. They were either taken out of context or misquotes or just completely incorrect.
I see. I mean, that maybe is a very good point. Where do most of the conspiracy theorists get their evidence for conspiracy?
From other conspiracy theorists.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of circular citations here. If you look at some of these articles, they have the appearance of academic rigor. But when you really get down to the footnotes, you see they're citing other conspiracy websites, which are citing other conspiracy websites or other conspiracy books. You have to go a long way before you find something that a scientist or a historian would recognize as an actual fact. So what we dug down and looked for those, and we found that very typically they were wildly out of context. For example, Thierry Meyssan, the French author who in some ways started a lot of this or was one of the first, he wrote a book called 9/11: The Big Lie that alleges that the Pentagon essentially attacked itself with a guided missile. And in one of his speeches in the Middle East, he quoted an eyewitness who said that it looked like a cruise missile with wings. Well, actually, I don't have the page open in front of me, but we talked to that eyewitness. He's a journalist, actually. He was stuck in traffic outside the Pentagon, and his full quote goes something like, I looked up and I saw this jet, this American Airlines jet. It went right over us. It looked like a cruise missile with wings, and it hit the building. So when you see the full quote, and you see that it's not just an accidental, it wasn't like he was sort of accidentally quoted out of context. That's a pretty severe, that's a pretty severe case of taking somebody out of context. And he's very upset about it and feels outraged that his words have been misused. And we found that again and again. We went back to the source material. We went back to the engineers and scientists you see quoted on these sites. Turns out they strongly object to how their quotes and words are being used.
As long as we're talking about the Pentagon, that is one of the main claims, is that it was hit by a cruise missile, and they say there's no debris from the plane to be found near the Pentagon.
Right. And in fact, there was some debris on the lawn, but a plane traveling at 500 miles an hour hitting a reinforced concrete building, it's not just going to crack in half and sit on the lawn. The plane struck the building and largely entered the building and tore through the Pentagon. The pieces of the plane, the shredded pieces, were recovered. The black box was recovered. The bodies of the passengers and crews were recovered and identified through forensics. There's photos of a chunk of landing gear that made it all the way through a couple of rings of the Pentagon, or a ring. So actually there's a mountain of evidence. But what we typically see in conspiracy theories is that people zero in on just a few little details and ignore the great body of evidence in support of the mainstream view.
Another one of the issues that's always regarding the planes, a lot of people claim that, for example, the hijackers couldn't have had enough training to pilot these planes.
Yes, we say that a lot, and it's amplified by the idea that the flying they did was some kind of extremely difficult Top Gun level flying. In fact, all of the pilots had at least 250 hours of flight time. They were all FAA certified commercial pilots. They weren't great pilots, and they didn't exactly distinguish themselves in flight school, but they got through it. They got the training they needed. And what they did that day wasn't particularly difficult by the standards of aviation. They took over planes already in flight on clear days. All they had to do was program the GPS unit, which is not that different from the one you might have in your car, and then fly to major cities and crash into the biggest buildings in those cities. And in fact, while they were flying, they weren't flying that well. There were phone calls reporting that the planes were making jerky movements and up and down. A couple of times they hit the microphone thinking they were talking to the passengers in the cabin. In fact, actually they were talking to air traffic control. That's the only reason, in fact, that they were able to figure out initially that planes had been hijacked. So they weren't great pilots, but sadly for us, they were good enough.
Some people feel as if military planes could have possibly shot those planes down before they even got to their targets, but they didn't make it because of orders that they should stand down.
Yeah. This is a very widespread view, and this, I think, in some ways, it goes back to called the myth of government hypercompetence. In a lot of conspiracy theories, you see this idea that NORAD is this incredibly organized coast-to-coast system that, anytime a commercial aircraft goes off course, they've got a F-15 on its tail within minutes, and they know exactly where every plane is at every time. We were surprised to find out how disorganized and incomplete it really is. NORAD was really set up. It's a relic of the Cold War. It was set up to intercept bombers coming in from overseas. Over time, they adapted, and they were kind of focused on drug runners and other things. But their entire orientation was to aircraft entering the United States from outside. Now, you could argue they should have been more prepared. They should have thought about the possibility of hijackings and other things, but they really hadn't done that enough. And so the failures to intercept those planes on that day, they didn't need a stand-down order. They weren't ready. And, in fact, there are actually very few aircraft in the entire continental United States. There were only 14 aircraft that were ready to fly as part of NORAD. People have this idea that every Air Force base is planes fueled and ready to take off, and it's not the case. And a lot of people can't imagine the government isn't more on the ball, but, in fact, they weren't.
Has that situation changed now?
Yeah, it's totally changed. I mean, they've completely reoriented their protocols. But also think back to September 10th. Would you have wanted to live in a country where every time a commercial aircraft goes slightly off course, there's an F-15 on your tail with armed Sidewinder missiles just ready to shoot you down? I think that would have been, for most of us, a very, very chilling prospect. So to assume that that was the case and that, Dick Cheney or somebody had to order them not to shoot is really to imagine a world that just did not exist at that time.
Maybe a